All right, let's get started. So we just had, what are we doing? We're trying to make it to this week. That's my goal. One more week, we're going to make it. We just had some big deadlines this morning, so I'm fine taking some lecture time to talk about it. We spent like 10 to 15 minutes in the other lecture. They had questions, mostly complaints, and let's kind of take some time to, I don't know, even if you just have to vent, that's fine. But to talk about the deadlines that just passed. I don't think I had anything of my own to open with. So if nobody has questions, we can just go right into content. That's fine. I do have one thing that came up. And this frustrates me. It's frustrating a lot of you. It frustrates me as well. That I'm not showing the error messages anymore in Autolab. This is due to abuse. Somebody was using the error messages to cheat on the homework. They're they successfully got my test cases because what I'm doing is showing the error message. Whenever an error is thrown, whenever an exception is thrown, I'll give you the message on that error as something to help you out, help you debug. And I like doing that. It's not something that has to be done. It's not the worst loss from my perspective because you should be able to find those errors without Autolab telling you exactly what line the error is on. But I do like giving that information, especially when it's something where your code is working fine, but it doesn't gel with the autograder. It can help you find like the typos. You had add route camel case instead of add underscore route or something silly like that. It helps you find those things a lot faster than you would if you had to look up the document. But now we have to go back to looking at the document, spotting your errors that way, which not the worst thing. But the issue, what happened with this, is if you raise your own exception, you can put any message that you want in there, and that message will be displayed on Autolab. So with this particular student, at least one that I found, it might be more, but all it takes is one person to ruin it for everybody. This is why we can't have nice things type of deal. But what they were doing was raising an exception with the inputs that I gave them. So getting the request, it was in the route request, getting my request that I used for a test case, and doing raise request.method request.path and sending that information up to the autograder so they could see what my test methods and paths were. And then they would hard code, if I see this path, then route it this way, return this way. Which is just ridiculous on so many levels. But once I saw that, I had to do something. I have to, once I'm aware that I was always aware, but I didn't think anybody would actually go for this. But now that it's out there and people are doing it, I have to plug the loophole so it doesn't exist anymore. My first strategy for this was to ban the keyword raise, because then you can still see your error messages, your legit error messages, but you can't raise your own exceptions. Unfortunately, some students do use the keyword raise in the actual design of their app. That's just how their app is designed. If you want to raise exceptions, I don't want to restrict that because anybody doing that, I definitely don't want to restrict them because they're just using software engineering principles, using the language the way it's designed to be used. That's perfectly fine. Every fucking time. That's probably the door's fault more than anything, but y'all can, I don't know, when you're coming in late, do you not make sure the door closes gently? What's that? It's locked open now, because it was locked closed, both of these. That was, I don't know, how we have door issues. These are silly issues to have. But anyway, so I don't want to prevent people from legitimately using it, so I had to update the grader again, because immediately there were people complaining that they were legitimately using raise. I don't want to hinder them. So I just removed the error messages completely. It's not my favorite solution, but it is kind of where we're at, where we have to be at with this, unfortunately. Which is fine. LO1s used to be manually graded. You would get one shot. You had to actually test your own stuff and submit manually graded by the TA, and if the TA got an error, it's just a 1 on the objective. That's it. So we still have way more feedback than we used to have. But I do want to give the error messages back. I just don't have a good way to actually do it in a way that doesn't expose a vulnerability to the grader. Doesn't attacking the tests that way just not work? It breaks the auto-grader LOs, but won't the manually graded LOs just fail completely because their hard-coded solutions don't work for when manually grading? So they were doing it for the router, and the router's not required for the rest of the objectives of the homework, so they would have gotten away with it. It's how they're just getting through the LO1 stuff. And then they wouldn't use their router in their actual code. So that loophole did exist. Yeah. I feel that pain. Whoever, well, I know who it is, but I obviously can't share their name. Though it would be fun to, because they really hindered the entire class. No, I don't want to talk about it anymore, unless there are questions. But I gotta stop myself. Yeah, exactly. Nicholas was the first person to bring it up when I had the grader banning Ray. Nicholas is, if y'all don't know, he's IT staff here. He's a former student and former 312 TA as well. But when he was a student, he did legitimately use Rays, and I told him what I did with the grader, and he's like, "You can't do that. Like, that would break my code. What the hell?" And then there was a Piazza post, and it actually did break their code. I'm like, "Oh crap, I don't want to do this." But I'm hoping I can think of a better solution. If anybody else has an idea out there, I don't know. It's such a It's a tough one. How would I? Yeah, Rays is not banned currently. So if you submit with Rays in your code right now, it's perfectly fine. I updated the grader, so Rays is not a banned keyword anymore. But yeah, I mean, you put the /s, but that really is probably the answer. A really complex regex that checks, but no regex is going to be perfect there is the problem. I don't know. It's tricky. It's a tricky problem. Because it sucks for me and the TAs as well. In office hours, the first thing I like to see, if you come to my office hours with an issue, the first thing I say is show me the Autolab output. Because if there is an error message, I want to see what that error message is so I can help you quicker, help you better. So I like having those too. The TAs like having them too. So hopefully we get something better down the road, but this is where we're at. So that's why I just want to make sure everybody knows why we're in this situation. It's because students will find any way possible to cheat, and it's ridiculous. And I absolutely hate that people do things like this, because, like, if you're going to do that, why are you even here? Like, why? I don't get it. Why are you in an elective, if you're going to cheat through the elective, pay me to teach you things about web applications and then cheat your way through the assignments? Like, that doesn't make sense. But then even, why are you in college if you're going to have that attitude and that approach to I just don't get it on so many levels. But at the same time, I have to protect the integrity of the course, or else there's going to be a bunch of cheaters with good grades that are mixed in with honest students' good grades, and it's just a really unfortunate situation. Ooh, actually, I like that one, Nicholas. If you have don't ban the keyword raise, but if you have the keyword raise, then I don't show the error messages. And then the legit students who are legitimately using raise probably aren't going to need the error messages. They're just going to write better code. And then the ones who are, I like that a lot. The ones who are using it to abuse the system, they don't get their feedback. I like that a whole bunch. You might have saved the whole class, Nicholas. Everyone thank Nicholas. And what do you, if I don't want to rant about this because most of y'all who show up to lecture probably agree with me on this, but like the students who are going to cheat through college, what do they plan to do when they get out there in the working world? One, they're probably not going to get through the interview process. The interview process for tech jobs is designed to make sure you actually know your stuff, because, hiring managers, like engineers in industry, they're not dumb. Like, they know that there is cheating that occurs in college and that we don't catch everybody, unfortunately. So they have an interview process that you all have to go through now, mostly because of that issue, that students can get a good grade with a good GPA and a diploma and everything, and hardly know anything. So they have to put you through an interview process to figure out if you know your stuff. But even if you get through that interview process without knowing anything because you use ChatGPT and your buddies throughout 4 years of college, what are you going to do after that? Like, you're going to get fired in a few months. Like, what's the long-term plan there? I never could figure that one out. I think they just have no long-term plan. I don't know. I fail to get myself in that mindset. I kind of want to know what they're thinking. The only thing I can think of is it's just pure desperation at deadlines, and they don't think it through. That's the only thing I can really think of, which, I don't know, probably is the case. All right. I don't want to rant about that too much unless encouraged by chat, but yeah, and then there's the horrible situations where they try to cheat in the job interviews, and that's just its own set of problems that I don't want to get into. Okay. If there are no other questions, we kind of got sidetracked here. So if there are no questions on the deadlines, we just had the homework 1 final deadline, so we'll get that grading done, and then the homework 2 deadline. I think it was in this lecture I talked a little bit about the grading logistics that you might get or was that not even in a lecture? I'll just talk about it then. We will grade homework 1 and homework 2 simultaneously. We were going to do homework 2 and then homework 1, but talking with the TAs, we all agreed that the homework 1 feedback needs to be done in a timely manner. You're going to be freaking pins and needles waiting for that grade to know if you are continuing on with the course or not. So we want to get those out sooner rather than later. So it'll be a 1-week deadline for all the grades. So by next Monday morning, all the grades for homework 1 and homework 2 have to be out. I want to get homework 1 done a little quicker than that, but I don't think it's actually going to happen, so I don't want to get my hopes up too much. The homework 1, anybody who's at risk of failing the class, so the TAs are grading homework 1 and homework 2, and anybody who who is in danger of failing the class, the TAs grade your homework 1 and you don't have all 3 LOs. I'm personally going to take a look at all those. I plan to do that Thursday. Hopefully I can get through them all Thursday and get them grades out, because I want everybody to be able to know how that went, how the results are for homework 1. And then homework 2 probably won't be till Monday morning. So that's the timeline of grading. Between Thursday and Monday for homework 1, and most likely Monday for homework 2. Okay, any other questions on logistics or anything? Are you all just ready for content? Let's do it. Okay, so we talked about uploading files, and we use that to upload images. How do we do that? How do we do the same thing but handling videos? And it's the same exact thing. Okay, we're done. We handle video uploads. That's it. Files are just bytes. I don't care if those bytes are an image or a video. Your code's going to be the same exact thing. The homework 3 is mostly about handling the multi-part format. And that multi-part format can carry any binary data at all. As long as we're not converting our binary data to a string, we're good. And which, by the way, a lot of the errors in Autolab that I've been seeing on homework 3 at least, it's students converting binary files to strings. We can avoid that. Like, that's an error you shouldn't need Autolab to point out. I've said that like 1 billion times, and I'll say it all throughout this week also. That we can't convert those bytes to a string. But we're already doing that. We already handle that. Right from LO1, we can handle multi-part uploads with arbitrary binary data. Video is just arbitrary binary data. Who cares if it's a video and not an image? It's the same exact thing. Image uploads, video uploads, it's multi-part form parsing, that's it. Problem solved. And this goes along with homework 3. LO1 is probably the bulk of the difficulty, just handling the multi-part format itself. LO2 is taking that format, everything you've written in LO1, and applying it to image uploads, saving the files, going to your database. You know, there's a lot of bookkeeping in LO2. but I think it's, in my opinion anyway, it's easier than LO1. And then LO3, again, in my opinion, I have to qualify it because somebody will come up after the homework and say, you lied to me. In my opinion, LO3 is trivial after you get through LOs 1 and 2. So once you get through LO1, it should be downhill for LO2 and LO3. And for what it's worth, I think AO1 is kind of free as well. If you're getting through LO1, if you're continuing with the course and serious, you're completing homework 3 for sure, you get LO1 done, you should get all the way to AO1, I would as a student. And then AO2 can be a little bit trickier. But AO1 is, in my opinion, one of the easier AOs in the course. Okay, but let's talk about all this stuff. So we already handle multi-part form uploads from LO1, videos, same thing, we're done. We handle video uploads. It's displaying the videos that we have to talk about. So LO3, that's when we get into videos, adding video support on top of our image support. And it's actually more of a front-end objective, is how do we actually display these videos to the user? And even this part isn't too hard. Here it is, right here. So we can't use the image tag like we use for images. We have to use the video tag instead. So we're going to use a video using syntax like this. Pretty straightforward. We put the source of the video in here, and this will display the video to the user and play the video. So a little bit different format than the image tag, but the same idea. We have an HTML element that's going to use the default video viewer, video player for the browser. Just like the file picker where the browser has a built-in file picker, that's the same across all websites for that browser. It also has a built-in video player. So if you're using Firefox, you're going to get the same default video player for any site that uses the default video player. And you can use it just by invoking this tag, this element. You're going to get the video player that looks something like this. Now, most major sites, you won't always see this video player. This is a Chromium default video player. You won't always see this video player because most major websites have their own custom video player. They're not going to use the browser built-in one. YouTube doesn't use your browser's built-in video player. They're using their own custom JavaScript video player. But this is what you do to get the default one. And that's about it. So not too difficult. This used to be a lot up until HTML5, which is pretty old by now. HTML5 came out and said, let's add video tags, video elements like this. And ever since then, every major browser supports has a default video player that you can invoke using this video tag. So pretty straightforward these days. Let's go through this. The width attribute, I'm not talking about on the slide, but it's helpful to have a width attribute. If you don't add width, then your higher resolution videos are going to be larger. Just like when you have your images, it's nice to have some consistent sizing to them. The other attributes, I have controls, autoplay, and muted. Let's go through these. Controls is going to display all the controls to the user. If you don't have controls, you're not giving any of those buttons to the user. They can't control the playback at all. They can't even pause the video. It's not a nice thing to do to your users, so give them the controls. Autoplay and muted are exactly what they sound like, but the autoplay is blocked. I was going to say doesn't work, but is blocked by some browsers in some circumstances. Different browsers do different things because they want to enforce a better user experience. So for example, in Chromium-based browsers, if you use autoplay, you have to also have it muted. So if you're not muted and you try to say autoplay, Chromium will say, you know what's really annoying? When you load up a page and it automatically has a video playing audio and just blasting out your speakers and everything. That's really annoying, so we're not going to let people do that, at least not with the default built-in video player. There are ways around it. Obviously, we go to sites and get annoyed by that all the time. But if you're using the default player, muted with autoplay, then Chromium will actually autoplay the video. And there are tons more of these available. You can do a lot of different things with this player. These are the three that I like to use. These are the three I find most useful. And muted only because I want to use autoplay. All right, and then we're going to specify the source for the video using a source element that's inside the video element. And it's just like the source of an image in that we're specifying the path for a video. I'm just doing space.mp4 in the root path. but this is where you would do like public/videos/space.mp4, whatever your path is, wherever you're hosting your video files, that's what you put for the source here. And then the MIME type. Specify the MIME type. Technically optional if you want to have the browser guess what your video type is, what type of video this is, if it's an MP4 or something else. But it's best to have it there. Let's not rely on the browser sniffing out MIME types. Let's specify the MIME type here. Or I guess, oh, never mind. And for what it's worth, this syntax is allowed. You can have syntax similar to image syntax where you put the source as an attribute right in the video element. And it works just like you would expect it based on your understanding of image tags. The only difference here is that the video tag is not self-closing, so you have to have an open and close tag on your video. Other than that, it's similar syntax as image. So this is allowed. We usually don't like to do this. One, we can't specify the MIME type right in the source of the video. And two, we can only have one source. So why would you want more than one source? It seems like a silly thing. But that is actually something we like to do with videos, is specify multiple sources for the same video. I guess technically they could be different videos entirely, but usually the same video. And what the browser will do is look through these sources and respect the order that we have the sources in and play the video in the first format that it supports. So in this example, we have an MPEG- source, an HLS source, and an MP4 source. Most browsers, Chromium-based browsers, most browsers don't support these first two formats by default. So it'll skip these first two formats and default to the MP4 format for this video. So it'll ignore the first two, but if we have a browser that does natively support those other formats, it'll use the first one that it supports. If it supports all three, it's going to use the first one that we list. So it is helpful to have multiple formats, multiple sources for this reason, so we can specify multiple formats and give our preference. If we have some special format that we would prefer, but we'll fall back to MP4, which is pretty universally supported, then we can specify that this way. And then finally, we can add text. Text is pretty unimportant these days, if I'm being honest. This text will be displayed if the browser doesn't support the video tag itself. If the browser doesn't support HTML5, which is pretty darn old at this point, this text will not be displayed. You might think, like I thought, that the text would be displayed if it doesn't support any of these formats. Then it would display this text. But that's not the case. It'll only display this text if it doesn't support the video element at all. If it doesn't have HTML5 video element support, that's when this text will be displayed. So that shouldn't be any users these days. If you're out there contributing code to a large app that has millions of users where some very, very tiny fraction of those users will have Internet Explorer still or have never updated their device in 20 years, something like that, yeah, maybe you want to add some text to let them know that they should update their stuff. But for most cases, we can lose those users, right? But if you're working for Facebook, I guess Meta now, if you're working for them and you have an elderly user base, maybe you want to support things like this where some of your users might have very outdated equipment that they're using. Then, yeah, maybe it's a little important. In CSE 3.12, I'm not concerned. All of us are going to have the latest versions of all the browsers. Okay, so for homework 3, for AO3 of homework 3, this is your expected workflow, code flow, I don't know. But this is what you're expected to do. Save the video to disk. This is the same as, do all the stuff that we did with images. You're extracting the bytes of the video from the multi-part request, saving those bytes to disk. And if you're identifying that this is a video and not an image, when you go to insert your chat message, you're going to insert the HTML of your video, so something like this, and I wouldn't be mad if you take this exactly, because a lot of you will do that anyway. I'll just make it clear. If this is what you use as your template for those messages, that's fine. But put this HTML in your chat message. Replace the file name with the file that you save the video as, whatever your naming convention is, whatever it is, splice that into your string, and then save that HTML as your chat message. Same thing we're doing with images, where we're putting HTML directly into the chat message. This isn't the best way to do things, by the way, and I said this last time too, but this is acceptable and even expected for homework 3, to get through homework 3 on this one. We're putting HTML in the database as the chat message for this user. So if they're not logged in, it's guest, : and then the video should show up right in chat, or the image should show up right in chat, and save this HTML in as their chat message. Now, all of this HTML, every character of this HTML is controlled by you and your server, so there's no concern of an HTML injection attack. The only thing the user can control is the content of the file. You're not using their file name. If you use their file name, then they can start injecting HTML into this. But you're using your own file name with your own naming convention, and they only control the bytes of the file itself. So that's the only thing we would be concerned about, is if the bytes of this file contain some malicious stuff, then, well, let's watch out for that. But you're going to save this HTML unescaped in the database, and then when chat messages, when that endpoint is hit, it gets it just as a regular chat message. The HTML is not escaped, so it'll actually render as HTML on the front end. Now, we have I want to talk about the name also. So when you get to LO3, you're going to support image uploads and video uploads. And I say you should have naming conventions for these. And it's actually fine if you have the same naming convention for both of them. You're going to need some way to check to get the MIME type of these files. Maybe the naming convention is the best way, actually. Yeah, you know what? Maybe the naming convention is the best way anyway. But you don't need a naming convention for images and a naming convention for videos. You can have like Media 1, Media 2, Media 3. That would be fine, as long as you have some way to remember for each one what the MIME type is, so you can serve it with the correct MIME type. And then the rest of it is what the HTML is in the chat. That's going to determine when it's going to be requested based on the file name that you put in the source. And we have a pretty bad UX thing. This is fine for the homework. This isn't the way you would actually build things. And for next semester, I'll have to redesign the front end to get rid of this because it bugs me. But this is fine for grading purposes. Is that the UX, the front end, is using polling. So every time the polling interval is hit, it's going to get all of the chat history and then re-render all of that HTML to the screen. So all of your images are going to flicker. All of your videos, every time the polling interval is hit, all of your videos will reset and go back to the beginning of the playback, and they might not autoplay. They might be paused. This is fine for grading. It's horrible, horrible user experience. You wouldn't want to actually deploy a site like this, but we're going to be okay with it for now. When we hit homework 4, we're going to get rid of polling entirely, and we're going to move to WebSockets, and we'll fix those issues. But this is going to be fine for homework 3. So when you see that behavior, when you're testing your code, and you're like, oh my goodness, is this working the way it's supposed to? Yes, that's fine. I'm going to be okay with that on the grading end. So just a heads up on that one. It won't really be fun to use. You can crank up your polling interval by a decent amount, but make sure you don't put it up too high that the TAs are going to think it's broken if they don't wait long enough. Okay. And that's video uploads. Any questions on this? It was mostly front-end content for this one. We already talked about all the rest of the stuff. Let's plow forward then. File formats. So for LO3, you have to figure out, is this uploaded file in a JPEG or an MP4? That's your task for part of LO3. And for LO3, it's fine to check the file extension. So if it ends in the characters .jpg or if it ends in the characters .mp4, you can determine whether it's an image or file based on that. And that's fine for LO3, and that's the end of the learning objectives. That's perfectly fine. But these file extensions do have some issues. The file extensions are made for humans, not for code, not for computers. They're made for humans mostly. We look at the file name, and the file name contains an extension. It makes it very clear to us if I'm looking at some video.mp4, I know that that's an MP4 video. So it helps us humans. That's good. And it helps our operating system to help us. The operating system is going to use the file extension to determine what default program to use if the user double-clicks on that file. They're going to look up the file by file extension, look up the default program for that extension, and then use that program to open that file. So nice user conveniences, but the issue with this is that the file extensions are not part of the actual file itself. That's not part of the file. It's meta information that's stored on the file system of your operating system. That's not part of the file. So if that information is lost or separated, which is going to happen in, say, image uploads, video uploads, we have the bytes of the file in part of a multi-part, and then the file name is separated from the actual bytes. The file name's in a header. We have to add this extra piece of the content disposition header. We have to add the file name manually, which isn't always going to be the case. Sometimes the file name can get lost, and you just have the bytes of a file. So how do we identify the file in those cases? And the file name can just be changed. You can take a file and rename the file and change the file extension. It doesn't change anything about the contents of the file. It doesn't change the bytes of the file at all. It just changes the file name, and then the operating system is going to say, oh, let me swap out my default program because that's a different file extension. I'm going to use a different default program. So things get a little wonky there. Or the file extension might be just missing entirely. You can just delete a file extension. That's fine. You just have a generic file, like whatever. It's perfectly legal. I mean, there's nothing special about file extensions. It's just made to make our lives easier. But it doesn't change the file at all. Yeah, and you can do that. So a few things that we have to be concerned about is sometimes incompetent users might not have the right file extension. They might have renamed their file just carelessly and uploaded a file, and now you can't tell what type it is anymore. Or you might have malicious users who are intentionally trying to deceive you. They take their JavaScript and name it .png and upload that. Either case, we don't want this happening. We don't want to rely on the file extensions. And Nicholas is going to take it a step further even. And that's the end of the learning objectives. So at this point, LO1, LO2, LO3 are fair game for homework 3. You should be able to do all of those. There's no more lecture content for those except Friday. Oh, I didn't give a rundown of the week yet. Friday, I'll be giving mostly tips, tricks, examples, just an open-ended coding day and giving you help with homework 3. Helping you get started and stuff. I like doing those lectures every once in a while. I wasn't really able to fit one in the homework 1 and homework 2 content, but homework 3, we definitely got one coming up on Friday. So I'll do examples and stuff there. But the rest of today and all of Wednesday is going to be dedicated to application objectives. So any questions on the learning objectives? You should all know how to do the learning objectives for homework 3. Any questions on it? Which homework is the hardest? Oh, that's a good question. 4? WebSockets? I don't know. It used last semester it was homework 3, like easy hands down. It was homework 3. This semester, homework 3 and homework 4 are both pretty difficult. Last semester, both of those were combined into one homework, and there was no homework 5. So last semester I had an easy answer for you, but it's a little trickier this semester. I feel like they're pretty even. Michael thinks homework 4, though, with WebSockets do trip students up, yeah. WebSockets might be tough. Homework 5, I don't even know if I can say that. Homework 5 should be the easiest. But we were bouncing around ideas about what to do with homework 5. Homework 5 is no LOs, no learning objectives, so nobody has to do it to pass the class. And AO1, so it's going to be 2 AOs. AO1 is probably the easiest AO of the semester. And I don't know what AO2 is going to be yet, so I can't say definitively if it's going to be the easiest one. And they are all fun, yeah. That's accurate. But yeah, homework 3 is pretty tough. Homework 4 is pretty tough. Homework 2, the AOs were tough, but homework 2, the LOs, I know that it's still probably sore since the deadline was just this morning, but I don't think the LOs were too difficult for for homework 2. Homework 1's pretty easy. But yeah, I'm spending too much time on this. Store your DMs on the blockchain. Yeah, homework 5. I'll talk about homework 5 just a little bit. We have an idea of, no, I can't even say that because if I don't do it, I can't say that. All right, so let's talk about the application objectives. Application objective 1 on homework 3, I mentioned this earlier, but just a reminder, I think it's kind of free. I only have 1 slide of content on it, and I wasn't even going to do that. In AO1, I give the hint that I basically just say Google file signatures and figure it out. And that would have been fine enough. Most of you who get to that point would have figured that out. But I decided to add 1 slide, and I think this is even overkill. It's a pretty straightforward objective. So if you don't rely on the file extension, what are you supposed to do? How do you tell what type of file is if you can't trust the file extension, or if you lose the file name, if you lose the original file name, you just don't know? And the answer is file signatures. The first few bytes of any file are going to be its file signature, and that's going to tell whatever program's interpreting the bytes of that file, it's going to tell it what type it is. And it's going to say, this is my type, and then it's going to add some extra information, like if it's an image, what's the resolution, videos, what's the resolution, what's the frame rate, all the meta information like that. But the first bytes are going to be the signature. For example, for a JPEG image, these are going to be the first bytes of that image. So you have the bytes, the actual content of your file, the content itself, and you choose whatever you have for your, not choose, but whatever you have for your file types that you support. For AO1, that's GIF, JPEG, PNG, and MP4. So you have 4 file signatures, and you say, which one is it, if it's any of them? Which one is it? So you take the bytes of the file and say, does it start with these bytes? If it does, it's a JPEG. Every JPEG starts with these bytes. It's the file signature. I think it's partial. I think I cut off some of it for the slide. But every JPEG is going to start with those bytes. So if the file starts with those bytes, it's a JPEG. Now, these obviously can still be spoofed. This isn't 100%, but it's more reliable than a file extension. At least your incompetent users aren't going to mess with the bytes of your file and stuff. But your nefarious users, they might still try to trick you by changing the file signature. So something we still should keep in the back of our minds. That's irrelevant for homework 3. I don't have that as a security thing or anything that you can't trust the file signature. But I don't even know what we would do. If we can't trust the file signature, you just have a broken file at that point. If you're investigating and you really need to get that content, you can try to get the right signature on it, but that's not something our web server is going to have to do. So you have your list of 4 signatures, map them to the MIME type for each of those signatures, and then find the MIME type, each of those 4 MIME types. And if it's an MP4, make sure you're doing your video HTML in the chat message. And if it's one of the images, get your image in the HTML for the chat message, then mark down its MIME type to make sure you get the right MIME type when that file is being hosted. And that's it. That's all I had to say about AO1. Let's talk about FFmpeg. Or we can just hard code. I mean, you're expected to hard code this signature maps to this MIME type. That you kind of have to hard code. There's no real other way. And that's why I limited it to 4 file types. Like I didn't say host any type of image because you'd have to just be hard coding all the file signatures for every single type of image. That's just tedious, pointless work. 4 is a good proof of concept that you understand what's going on. Are file signatures how sniffing works? I don't know. It's probably part of it. It's got to be part of it, but I assume it's more advanced than that. I don't know how sniffing actually works, but I would have to assume it's more advanced. Like if it's a text file, if it's just text, there is no signature, so it has to do something, analyze it and see if it looks like JavaScript or looks like HTML. So it has to be a little more sophisticated than that, but I'd have to assume file signatures are part of the algorithm. I'd be surprised if it wasn't. Okay, let's talk about FFmpeg. So FFmpeg is a program. You'll install it, you'll run it, you'll install it in your Docker file and all that, and it is the program for video editing anything. If you're doing any video manipulation, if you're transcoding videos, if you're changing resolutions, whatever you're doing, FFmpeg is the answer. It's everywhere I look. Anybody doing video processing, it's FFmpeg every single time. I have not seen an exception to this, so if somebody sees an exception to this, let me know. Everybody is using FFmpeg. And if I say this strong enough, then finally, if there is somebody not using FFmpeg, somebody will let me know and say, Professor, you're full of shit. Like, here's somebody not using it. If you're using some video editing software, I'm willing to bet that software under the hood is using FFmpeg. I know OBS is using FFmpeg under the hood. I looked into that to see how it's working. It's all FFmpeg doing all the actual heavy lifting. And then OBS is just a wrapper around FFmpeg to give us a nice GUI and interface and all that stuff. FFmpeg is what's happening under the hood in your favorite video editing software, as far as I know. There might be a counterexample out there. We'll see. But this is the library. This is the video manipulation library. So you have to install it. I would install it locally so you can play around with FFmpeg without having to spin up Docker every single time. Install it locally, play around with it, make sure you have a good feel for it. But then when you're ready to submit, make sure you're installing it in your Docker file. Go into your Docker file and making sure you go through the installation process for your image to make sure it's in your Docker file, and then test it in Docker once you have it working locally. That's how I would do it. You don't want to spin up Docker every time you want to change an FFmpeg command, though. And you are allowed to use client libraries. I think it'll be harder to use a client library than to use system calls. My expected solution for everyone is to just use system calls directly. If you haven't messed around with system calls before, because if you didn't, I asked the other class, I said in operating systems you see system calls, but if you haven't taken operating systems, a system call is where you're invoking another program, from your software. So in Python, you would invoke FFmpeg and call it as though you were typing it into the command line to call the program. So system calls, that's my expected way, but if you find a client library that does what you want it to do and everything works for you, I am allowing that. That's perfectly fine. If you do use a client library, you still have to install FFmpeg, because all that client library is doing is making the system calls for you. It's just giving you a more user-friendly interface by calling methods instead of using command line arguments. Okay, so what are we actually talking about? Here's a very basic FFmpeg command, so we can start talking about what this even does. So in the command line, I'm invoking FFmpeg and giving it these arguments, which is going to convert input video.avi into an MP4. That's what this command would do. And I'm using several command line flags, command line parameters with flags to be able to do this. If you haven't messed around with the command line too much, I assume you all have at this point. I think at least in 220 you do a lot of this. But just in case, let me say this much. When you have a flag, this dash and then a letter, whatever argument follows it is controlled by this flag. So -i input video.avi means the input file name is input video.avi. And then the -f flag is specifying the format. So -f MP4, this is saying the format of the output file should be MP4. And then for FFmpeg, the last argument with no flags, there's no like -o for output or anything. The last command line argument is always going to be the output file name. So the last argument, output video.mp4, is going to save this transcoded video as an MP4. So I have my AVI, I want to convert it to an MP4. This is my way of doing that. There are tons and tons and tons of command line arguments that you can give this program. It's a very powerful tool. It can do so many things. One of them is -s, and I can specify the resolution. If I want to change the resolution, if I want to scale this video up or down, I can specify the output resolution using this -s flag. So now the output's going to be 640 by 360. And let's see it in action. Adobe Media Encoder doesn't. Okay. I knew if I said it strong enough, somebody would give me a counterexample. All right, let's see some demos of this. All right, so I have the space.avi is where I want to start. I'm going to write some HTML. This is going to put my video up there using either AVI or MP4. Let's open this in the browser, and I can see my wonderful video here. And it works. Yay. If I don't have much to say about that. We talked about that in the slides. If I get rid of this MP4 and reload the page, it's not going to load because my browser does not support AVI. It doesn't support that format natively, so I can't use this space.avi. And this part actually broke in the other lecture, so I have much less confidence than I had coming in. But let's try it a little bit different way. I used this command in the other lecture, and it didn't work, and I was frustrated. But I used this command before lecture this morning, and this did work, so I don't know what to think anymore. So let's do input space.avi. So if I only had the AVI file, and my browser doesn't support AVI, so I can't play this video in the browser, I'm going to transcode it from AVI into an MP4. I'm going to call it output video, and let's delete the existing output video so it's not there. And then it's going to take a bit. This is video processing. It's going to take a while, even for fairly small video files that I'm using. This is tens of megabytes for the space.mp4, like 10 or 15 for the AVI version. And then, so it took a little bit. And then let's do output. Oh my goodness. Output video.mp4. Let's see if this works. I'll hope. It might not. Hey, it worked that time. Specifying the resolution, maybe that made a difference, but that part didn't work in the other lecture, and I was sad about it. So we've made a copy of this. We transcoded AVI into MP4, and now I have the same exact video, same content in a format that my browser can play. And we can play around with the command line options and do all kinds of stuff. For those of you who are going to want to use a library, there is ffmpeg in your requirements.txt, import ffmpeg, add it to your requirements, and then you can start doing this. This code, it takes a while to run, so I don't have time to do it here, but it'll horizontally flip the video, and it gave me an output3.mp4, which is the same video, but horizontally flipped. So just a proof of concept that you can do neat things with